So yeah, Lizzie Robertson couldn't be with us today, but I'm going to try and do my best to do justice to her portions of the talk as well, as I kind of received them in a series of texts earlier today. So do bear with me for that section, because it isn't necessarily my forte. But this kind of work is situated within a slight aside, I guess, from both of our PhD research, which is focused within that kind of Glencoe landscape and other parts of the Highlands as well. But this relates to the work of a team of us at the University of Glasgow who've been running our annual summer field school. So there's a variety of different projects that we have as a kind of team of researchers that are interested in Glencoe as a landscape. So my own PhD research, which looked at the kind of shieling landscapes and how the kind of narratives that are wrapped into those. Lizzie Robertson, who's working particularly with kind of sound as a medium through which to explore different ways that we can communicate quite kind of nuanced narratives about Highland heritage, going on beyond those kind of concepts of clearance and Jacobitism, to really kind of explore the kind of complexities of how people experience these landscapes and understood their place within the world and some of these kind of ontologies. Gareth Beale, Lizzie Robertson and Michael Given have a project looking at digital glens and trying to explore, again in a kind of wider scope, the use of different technologies, both digital and more analog, to kind of communicate these kind of concepts with public audiences as well. And we have a kind of budding project, myself, Michael, Nikki, who was on earlier, Gareth, and Kimberly Davis as well. Hopefully going to be kind of expanding into exploring Rannochmoor and thinking a little bit about kind of the Little Ice Age as a kind of event that's changing how people perceive, understand, and interact with their landscape, and how that can be used to kind of communicate to other audiences, kind of themes around climate change. And then finally, we have the field school, which brings together myself, Michael Given, Gareth Beale, Nicole Smith, and Lizzie Robertson as well. And this is our kind of one of our three University of Glasgow field school projects. So the field school, as it was in 2023, brings together kind of three strands. So there's excavation, which I directed, which was at the Summerhouse of MacIain. There was surveys. There was a survey of the Coffin Roads in Cairns, which was the kind of Royal Forest of Buchael. And then there was also settlements on Rannochmoor, so a programme of kind of introductory survey based off aerial reconnaissance that I had done. The other strand that we have then is the creative media and engagement team. So they carried out kind of two different aspects. There was one which was looking at creative engagements with archaeological field practices, so thinking about different ways that we could record the experience of excavation, going beyond kind of quite prescriptive ways that we record the excavation practice, context sheets, registers, these sorts of things, but trying to think a little bit more about how we can record the experience of being on excavation, being within a landscape, being out in the field doing survey, but thinking about those kind of realities of archaeological practice, that kind of the stories that we create within the landscape through our practice that don't necessarily get recorded. And the second part of what they were doing was working particularly with the Glencoe Folk Museum and trying to kind of tell the stories of their collections and their collecting practice and the ways that we can kind of use those artifacts to tell stories within the landscape through a variety of different mediums. And again, some of that was through kind of digital mediums, so the students had a go at kind of creating their own soundscapes and audio tours and that sort of thing, and a podcast. And some of it was through more analog technologies, so creating kind of booklets and zines and such as well. And this project is kind of levelly co-directed by myself, Michael, Gareth, Nicole, and Lizzie as well. So this is the landscape we're working in. Presumably, I think everyone's fairly familiar with Glencoe. If you've ever gone to Fort William, you can't really, well, you could have missed it, I guess, if you came by Oban, but you would be choosing to go an odd way. But it's a pretty kind of iconic landscape. It gets kind of reproduced in kind of biscuit tin-esque fashion. But it kind of starts from the kind of fringes of Rannochmoor, which we'll see if we can do the pointy, kind of over here. And it heads up and kind of north and westish towards the Loch Leven, which runs kind of just over here. And Glencoe village is up here. And that's the kind of landscape that we've been primarily working in. Some of our kind of survey work that went on occurred down at Ba Cottage. So that's a kind of forester's cottage site out on Rannochmoor. Ba Farmstead, which is a new kind of settlement site with quite an interesting kind of chronology from maybe the 16th or 17th century onwards. Out on Rannochmoor, there's iron and Bloomery Mounds, there's kind of farmsteads and shillings all in a very close space. Great fun. They looked as well at Queen's House, which is a kind of interesting settlement site as well, where there seems to be a kind of late or early 19th century attempt to create a rival inn to the King's House Hotel, which ultimately fails. But there's a quite interesting kind of commercial history going on there as well. And then most of my own work as kind of running the excavations, and previously my PhD surveys have been in Glencoe. So those of you who were at this conference last year might have heard some of the results of the kind of shielding surveys and excavations that went on there. But that's kind of the area of the landscape that we've been working within. So as I said, the survey team, they had kind of two main focuses, I guess. They were looking at a kind of walkover survey was conducted in this area of the Royal Forest of MacIain, which had been previously surveyed as part of kind of heritage management exercises by the National Trust for Scotland. But they were trying to kind of seek to see how we could kind of tell stories about this landscape and get that kind of slightly tighter resolution of data that might allow us to say a little bit more about this place. It obviously has this association as a royal hunting forest from kind of medieval times onwards. But that quite quickly seems to have kind of fallen out with the kind of area that's being managed as royal forests, and it perhaps becomes like a hunting forest for perhaps initially the Stuarts of Appin and then later the Campbells of Argyll. But what's quite interesting actually is some of the kind of connections that are coming through for that landscape. So it's this forest centred on two Larrigs, Larrigailge and Larrigarten. And through Larrigailge, there's this quite interesting kind of series of trackways that lead over and down into Dalness, and Dalness being a kind of centre for another of the kind of MacDonald of Glencoe's farmsteads at one point. And so there's a system of coffin cairns on that kind of passing between the two, so that the bodies of those who died in Dalness could be carried to the burial grounds of the MacDonalds down in Glencoe village and Eelamundy, burial island off the coast. So the kind of second part of the survey done by our survey team was going out to record these structures out on Rannoch Moor and trying to think a little bit about what life would have been like out on that area of the moor as well. And we also carried an auger survey in advance of peat coring that we're going to do this summer in order to try and get a nice pollen record for this kind of later period. Apparently there was a big survey done of kind of pollen cores out on Rannoch Moor, and particularly in the kind of fringes towards Glencoe back in the 70s or 80s. But they were only interested in the kind of earlier prehistories, and so apparently they binned the upper portions of the cores. And it's really, really hard, as anyone who kind of understands kind of peat bogs might know, where there's been peat cutting, there's not going to be a recent record. And so it's been quite tricky to actually find areas that might give us a kind of peat record and a pollen record, for the time period that we're actually interested in. So that's another aspect of the work we've been doing. Onto the work of Lizzie, Gareth and Nicole. So the first kind of part of their work was this programme of trying to explore how we can think about recording excavation as a process, as a practice, and the survey as well, in a variety of kind of creative ways. And so the students kind of joined us out on site when they weren't excavating as well, with film equipment, with audio recording gear. They had hydrophones, they had contact microphones, they were attaching them to mattocks, they were dunking the hydrophone in when they were wet sieving. And catching all these different really interesting kind of noises and that are going on in the excavation experience. These were then kind of compiled together, and we created an audio-visual installation in the Turf House, reconstructed by Derek and the National Trust for Scotland Glencoe team. And that was put into place during our open day, which had about 600 visitors. So it was a really interesting kind of opportunity to have the kind of creative filmmaking and audio experiences that the students had created then put before a kind of audience as part of that practice. And it really got the students thinking a little bit about the different ways that they could record the experience. I think when we look at our kind of context sheet recording and such, everything's so very visual and kind of textural, and we think about there's quite a lot of kind of engagement with the senses, but we do really miss out sound, and I think anyone who spends a lot of time troweling would say that is one of the kind of senses that you are really using to kind of when you are excavating. It's that kind of you clang as you hit something that's not what you were digging just moments before, and that sound really is kind of part of that, but so are the other senses as well. And so they're trying to kind of engage with these kind of the sensory processes of excavation and how we could record and communicate those. The second portion of the work they were doing, as I said, was with the Glencoe Folk Museum, and so they created kind of animations for the Folk Museum to explain the processes by which the museum had come around. So it's a really interesting example of kind of a museum that's collections are primarily kind of rooted from donations from the local community, and so there's a really interesting and kind of quite eclectic mix of artifacts from a kind of reconstruction of the Ballahillish goddess figure, as it was when it came out of the bog before the NMS got their hands on it. And then kind of conversely as well, they have space hoppers and Victorian children's toys, and collections of bottles from Oban and all manner of other things as well. So there's a really interesting kind of collection there, and trying to kind of engage with the process by which its founder, Barbara Fairweather, and her kind of initial committee came up with the kind of North Lorne and Glencoe Folk Museum. That's as much as I can really go into on Lizzie's work, I'm afraid, based off the series of texts I was given. So I'll dive in a little bit. Oh, yeah, sorry, that was some of the kind of outputs there that were created as a result of that work. And some of these are going on into our kind of following season as well. So we'll be working with the National Trust for Scotland to try and create a kind of site-based and landscape-based audio podcast tour for their new Glencoe Greenway, which runs through a series of kind of township landscapes, and try and use that as a kind of vector for exploring kind of landscape change as you move through the landscape. And so that's one of the things we'll be doing. And we're also doing aspects of kind of printmaking and storytelling, and kind of creative ways of exploring how we can tell kind of landscape stories, plant lore, these sorts of things through kind of creative responses as well in the coming season. And that's the students at work recording, and quite interestingly, as they were recording the burn while they were doing some wet sieving, they found a cache of coins that someone had been throwing into the burn as like a wishing well. So that was quite a fun discovery right next to the excavation site. And yeah, we had our open day, which was, had over 600 attendees. You can see the audio visual installation was going on inside the turf house, and we had kind of opportunities for people to get hands-on with the artifacts as well. And onto the excavation, which is the bit that I'm kind of slightly more familiar with. So I'll kind of lead you through that. This is very much a kind of work in progress. So the excavations were only last summer. The kind of press release about our shiny find came out in October, and we've been kind of working our way through the post-ex processes at the moment. So we've only just last week got the pottery report back. The coin report came back on Monday. So I'll rely on my notes slightly to tell you some of the interesting stories we can tell from those. But yeah, it's a really interesting site and an interesting landscape. So it lies in Glen Lachnamuia, which is this kind of tributary glen to the south of Achnacon and the Clachay Gin, if you're familiar with Glencoe. But it's this kind of large glacial valley. It has a really interesting kind of history as a kind of seasonal transhumance landscape, which is initially why I kind of identified this landscape and carried out survey here. But also has this kind of township site that's recorded in particularly in kind of local oral histories, but also in those kind of travellers' accounts of the later 19th and early 20th centuries. It appears in Mary Donaldson's account and also Seaton Gordon's accounts as kind of one of these places that you go if you're doing the authentic Glencoe tour. You come to this, the Summerhouse of MacIain. But what did that actually mean was some of our kind of questions. But you can see it sits within this really kind of interesting and busy shieling landscape. So these are some of the shielings that I'd excavated as part of my PhD research. But they are within shouting range, not even shouting range. If children are playing at the holiday cottages, just kind of over here, you can hear them playing something mildly creepy. But there's a really interesting kind of auditory experience within this landscape whereby you can hear things that are going on quite far away. So absolutely, these are both within sight of each other and within kind of shouting range too. That's the kind of previous structures that were excavated before, so a kind of cluster of shielings, and then a shieling that was potentially also a whisky bothy as well. And an interesting kind of platform as well. But moving on to the Summerhouse of MacIain then, nice drone photo courtesy of Derek with his drone. But you can see here that we're sitting on this kind of lower slope, this nice kind of green talus slope just below Arnoch du Agleen. And this is the structure in its nice inked up trench plan. So you can see it has essentially three main spaces. At one end, there's what we initially interpreted as a kind of byre space, so at a kind of gravelly floor. Quite organic rich, but it wasn't quite clear what was going on. Deeply waterlogged. So we decided just to sondage it because we didn't really have the post-ex budget for doing conservation on lots of kind of preserved organics. But we're hoping to go back and excavate more in there actually, because we have some kind of evolving interpretations of what that might be. And there's this main space in here which has a really grand slab floor. So some of these slabs are kind of over a metre across. They're beautifully kind of worn slabs of schist. And there's this really interesting kind of gable end fireplace as well, which for those of you kind of familiar with kind of 17th, 18th century Highland abodes in the hills, byre houses, etc. Central hearth is kind of the classic. So it's quite odd really to have this hearth against the gable wall for this time period. And then finally, there's this kind of space here, which initially when we were being a little bit sceptical of the narrative that this was the chief's summer house, we described it as a tatty shed. In retrospect, actually, it's potentially something like a stable, or perhaps it is the byre for this structure, but it certainly has quite a complicated system of kind of drainage going on within the structure. There's different floors that are contemporary with each other that create kind of levels, and then a drain feature running out underneath the kind of entrance wall, the wall beside the entrance as well. So there's something quite interesting going on within this structure that kind of went a little bit, in reality, went a little bit beyond what we were expecting it to be. 5 minutes. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So in the kind of outbuilding portion, we had which potentially a kind of stable, really waterlogged again, which was really interesting. But we got this really nice Bayer grape, which potentially is kind of a manure fork, which adds to that interpretation of it perhaps being a stable or a Bayer. But there was also a drain that was packed full of pottery, bits of clay pipe, etc. Kind of domestic waste had clearly clogged it. But that gave quite firm dates to the early 17th century. And that's the Bayer grape out, which had, thankfully, quite a nice chunk of its wooden handle too. Still attached, just kind of showing off quite how waterlogged it was. And this is the structure in the interior then, in that kind of entertaining space as we've described it. So in our interpretation, this is a kind of high status, chiefly feasting hall associated with kind of hunting activity that's going on within these uplands. And we actually have a local Gaelic proverb which talks through a kind of high status, chiefly hunt in the area. And this is they name this glen as the glen that they start off from on their hunt. So that adds quite nicely to the story. You can see the really grand gable fireplace there with two kind of almost kind of orthostatic side pieces to the fireplace, and then this really, really grand slab floor. It has been slightly furcled in the middle. There's a reference to the farmer digging for potatoes. That seems slightly skeptical. I would be slightly skeptical of that. I think it's probably antiquarian rummaging, but there's a kind of reference to a silver pipe piece coming out. This is some of the kind of finds from the structure then. Not by any means exhaustive, and there are far more, but we've got really nice kind of shiny big chunks of plate, big serving plates, big serving dishes, and we've got pieces of kind of Bartman jugs. We've got quite a large assemblage of clay pipes, including some very early ones for a Scottish context, so right back to kind of 1580s to 1610s. We've also got quite a nice collection of kind of munitions there, and two nice, it ended up being three nice decorated spindle whorls because one got found in a soil sample. But yeah, that gives you a nice kind of photo model there to give a kind of sense again of kind of what this structure looks like. But what we're really kind of interested from this then is what can we say about what's going on within this structure, I guess. What can we say about diet and dining? And what does that kind of material evidence tell us about what's going on inside this structure? And so from Derek Hall, who's carried out our pottery analysis, we probably have about 4 Bartman jugs. So these are the big kind of German beardy face jugs. They're being imported probably as part of these kind of Hanseatic League connections, and they're bringing in wine. So we've got continental wine being consumed here. We have a really flashy array of European and English serving plates that are being brought in, as well as jugs, including jugs from Siegberg, Westerwald, Frenchen, Rhenish, and Langevin pottery types. We've also got potentially 2 fragments of kind of bouviers, so French serving jugs as well. So really quite flashy material, considering, as described by Derek Hall, it might be one of the richest pottery assemblages from a rural context from the 16th, 17th century in Scotland. What's quite interesting about some of the material as well is it's actually quite early, some of it. So it spans quite a long period of time, right from the kind of mid 16th century right the way through towards the kind of end of the 17th century. So we have quite a long period of occupation for this structure as well. And most of that material was coming from kind of in situ deposits as well, which is really nice and quite unusual for a rural context in this regard. What's quite interesting is there's almost an entire absence of cooking vessels. And we had no faunal assemblage at all, even burnt bone coming from the fireplace. So clearly we've missed the kitchen. The kitchen is not where that fireplace is. And so our reckoning is that probably that kind of gravelly end that we'd initially interpreted as a byre is in fact the kitchen. And that's just a view construction drawing that I've kind of scrabbled together to give a sense of the kind of scale of the structure and some of the shiny things that were within it. That was the other shiny thing that was in it, of course, was our coin hoard, which was generated quite the excitement in the news. And I've also just got the report back from that. So I'll just quickly list off some of the kind of interesting bits we've got from it. So the coin hoard makes up quite an interesting collection of coins. They're not the kind of standard material that you would expect in a coin hoard as they've been traditionally found in Scotland. And so it's quite a long time range that's actually represented here. And again, quite a lot of these coins don't actually have any monetary value in a Scottish system, which adds to what quite is going on. So we have 23 English coins, not that unusual perhaps for a Scottish coin hoard, 1 from Henry VIII, 3 from Mary, 6 from Elizabeth, 3 from James I and VI, 5 from Charles I, 3 from the Commonwealth, and 2 from Charles II. So taking us pretty much from 1544 to the 1670s or 80s. From Scotland, we have 4 coins, 2 from Charles I and 2 from Charles II. So taking us from about 1637 to 1679. We have 3 coins from France and a jeton. So we have a jeton of Louis the XIII, which seems to be related to the kind of accountancy system of the court of France, the Council of the King. And we also then have 3 silver coins of Louis XIV as well. So that's also bringing us from 1642 to 1676. We have 2 coins from Spain or the Spanish Netherlands. So we've got Philip the Fourth, and we've got a Charles II, which is from the Spanish Netherlands as well, and that's taking us from 1636 to 1680. And then we have 1 Irish coin, a James I and VI from 1600, and a Papal States coin of Clement the VIII from 1600 as well. So it's quite an eclectic mix of coins here. Quite a lot of these, being kind of bronze or jettons even, don't actually have any monetary value. We've got a coin weight as well. So what is going on here with these coins? They're really, really interesting. And so what we think we've got, and our kind of initial interpretation, is that this isn't actually, these aren't being collected for their kind of monetary value. They're actually a kind of curation of coins or a collection of coins. And that these are kind of representing perhaps the kind of personal travels of members of that kind of chiefly family. And we know that certainly MacIain, the chief who's killed in the 1692 massacre, was potentially educated in Paris, but he'd certainly travelled around kind of continental Europe in his youth before being recalled when his father dies. And that might be kind of one aspect of what's going on, is kind of displaying their worldliness, which would fit quite nicely with the kind of themes of the pottery assemblage as well, which is very kind of flashy imported pieces. There's also this kind of notion that some of the coins might have been used as kind of amulets, so obviously figures of the king or the cross, which are quite common and prevalent on coins, worn as amulets, were kind of sometimes considered to have certain kind of healing properties or lucky properties. And similarly, coins could be broken in half to kind of swear an oath. And so that represents a fair chunk of our assemblage too, particularly some of the older pieces. So I think one of these is an Elizabeth and the other 2 are Mary's, which kind of sets in place that idea that there's perhaps kind of significant events are being commemorated by artifacts or pieces within this collection as well, which something weird is going on. And so from this small hut in the hills in the kind of corner of Glencoe, we have this really, really great kind of network of connections that spreads out. And some of the kind of interesting themes for that, for being on the west coast of Scotland, is that actually the connection is often quite strongly in favour of that eastward direction. So particularly into Germany, that's where most of our pottery is coming from, but also the Low Countries as well. And there's comparatively little, 2 pieces of French pottery and no Spanish pottery at all, which is quite unusual really for your kind of west coast high status sites, thinking Eilean Castle Sween, etc. So there's something quite weird going on. Yes, absolutely. And so we're hoping to do a bit more with the kind of environmental science as such, and we'll be back next year to do some more field work in Glencoe as well. And I'll wrap up there. Thanks to all these people.